Okay, a little bit of review, what we did yesterday. Anatomy of an HTML element. So we've got an opening tag, a closing tag. What does the P represent? Yes, it's a paragraph, but what does it mean in the context of this tag? If it were H1 or div or whatever, what's the general term for what that is, what the P is? Yes, it's an element. So the P is the element name. And what are class and ID? They are attributes. That's right. And greeting and main are their values. So what does that make hello world? It is the inner text. It's the text content. And we preferred text content to inner text because it's standard and behaves the same across all browsers. But generally, whatever is between the opening and closing tag represents the contents of that element. So if it were another, it could be another element. There could be several elements nested deep with text in various places throughout. It's the contents of the element. In this case, yes, it's text. So we talked a little bit about CSS selector syntax, mostly not for the sake of actually writing style sheets, but for the sake of querying elements, grabbing them from the DOM. And we learned several ways of doing it. By element name is one of them. So if I wanted to grab that element just based on its element name and nothing else, how would I write that? Document.querySelector what? You need parentheses and you need quotes because it's a string. Dot means something. What does dot mean? It means the class. So if we wanted to just get it based on the fact that it's a paragraph, not knowing any of that other stuff, yeah, I just put a P. So if you grab it just by element name and nothing else, that's just P. To grab it by a class, you precede the class name with a dot. So you can grab it by class name with dot greeting. Or both. Element name and class name. If you just say dot greeting, then that will grab any element on the page that has a class of greeting, whether it's a paragraph or a span or a div or whatever. This will only grab paragraphs with a class of greeting. What about grabbing it by ID? We didn't actually do that yesterday. It is. It's a hash, yep. So hash main would grab that element based on the fact that it has an ID of main. And unlike classes, only one element on the page is allowed to have any given ID. They are supposed to be unique identifiers. HTML, as you may have discovered, is very forgiving of violating its rules. It will always try to render something. So if you do give more than one thing an ID of main, it's not going to fail to render, but behavior could be unpredictable because you are breaking the rules. So don't do it. Don't give more than one thing an ID with the same value. There is also document.getElement by ID, by the way. I'll talk about that in a second because we're going to talk more about the DOM. So document.anything, that's the DOM. That document element is the root of the DOM, and the DOM is, for all intents and purposes, the sort of standard library for JavaScript when you're running it in the browser, or the API for the browser. We learned about selecting all elements on a page that match a particular selector, and that is document.what? To find all matches. Query selector all. That's right. So this would find all paragraphs on the page. To select one matching element, it's just document.querySelector. So for example, if we wanted to find the element with an ID of main. Now in that particular case, there is also document.getElement by ID, which is older. It's been around a lot longer than query selector and query selector all. but it's not used a whole lot anymore because we have query selector now, and you can just pass a string like that. But if you did use get element by ID, you would not put the hash in there. You would just say main. We learned how to grab the content element and how to set the contents of an element. We learned a couple different ways: text content and inner HTML. The difference being apparent from the name. If you set the inner HTML, you can actually put tags in there and they will render. If you were to put tags inside inner text content, then it would actually print out angle bracket div whatever. So that's a little of what we did yesterday. We also learned about event listeners and other stuff like that. Today, we are going to talk more about functions. We wrote a function or two yesterday, but we're going to learn a lot more about them and how variable scope works inside functions. And we're going to learn more about JavaScript objects, which were not covered in the Code Academy lesson, but you did have to use them to finish the Code Wars, so sorry about that. But it was good for you to have to Google it, or to have to email me, which is what happened a little more often. All right, and we're going to talk a little more about how to organize our code in a slightly more structured way than just throwing a bunch of functions in a file. Sound good? Are you hyped? Is it lit, as the kids say? Very good. All right. Here we are. Add form values to details using document.createElement and append child instead of inner HTML. Bonus credit, break out some of this functionality into a separate function. And super mega bonus credit, do not hard code the names of the fields in your JavaScript. Loop over all of the elements in the form. So you could add an arbitrary number of elements to this form without changing your code, and it would still work. Sounds pretty tricky. Who got the base level homework done? Check it out. All right. Who got the bonus credit? Super mega bonus credit? Cool. Heck, I'm happy you just tried. All right, so where we left off, we'd already extracted render color into its own function. And we were already using document create element there instead of inner text or inner HTML. But we are using inner HTML to build the list item itself, or the list items and the unordered list. And we created the function by assigning it to a variable. We could also have used a plain old function expression. Function, name of function, argument list, no arrow. Now let's see what the difference is. Let's move render color. I know. Let's try console log render color blue. I'm just going to put that right in the page, not inside any particular function. So it should run as soon as the page loads. And it should just log that. So let's give that a shot. You don't necessarily need to copy that because I'm going to erase it. But all right, there it goes. Background color, blue. What if I now, see, I used render color before I even declared it, before I even brought it into existence. What if I change this back to assign color to a variable? Const render color equals an anonymous arrow function. Refresh the page. Uncaught reference error. Render color is not defined at index.js line 3. Won't let me do that. So what we saw was something called function hoisting. If you do it with a function expression using the keyword function, as long as you're within the same scope, you can use it before you've actually declared it. Because when it's parsing the JavaScript, it will first find all of those things and bring them into existence before it actually starts executing line by line. But if we do it with a variable assignment, that's not the case. You can't use a variable before you declare it. So that's a little difference between those two ways of doing it. Yeah. Var is sort of hoisted. It's not quite the same. Let's try that. It doesn't work. But what you're thinking of, there is a different kind of hoisting that happens there. It's as though I had written var render color and just not initialized it, but I had declared it. So it will be like it exists. It just won't be set into anything yet. But with const, that's not the case. It just plain won't exist until you do that. Good question. So we're going to keep assigning them to variables for right now. In some frameworks, it's common to actually take advantage of hoisting and intentionally put all your functions at the bottom. In Angular 1, for example, the official style guide suggested that you do that sort of thing. That's not what we're doing, so we're not going to do it. So we're generally not going to use things before we declare them, at least not for right now. So we've got a function there. Now what was the first part of the homework again? Oh yeah, use document.createElement and append child instead of inner HTML. Now, this is going to get pretty long pretty fast, so I'm going to go ahead and start breaking them into functions as I do this. So if ultimately we don't want to set the inner HTML of details, but rather want to append children to it, it only has one direct child, right? The UL. The LIs are all children of that UL. So, okay, render color, that's a naming convention we've basically established. So we could say const list equals render list. And then we can make sure that render list returns that UL element. And then we can say details.append child, append child, list. That's how we want this to look when we're done. So I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. In other words, dress more nicely than your boss expects you to. Well, right now, we're writing this for the function we want, not the function we have. Render list doesn't actually exist yet. But I'd like it to. I'd like to be able to write handle submit this way. So I went ahead and used it because it can kind of help me plan out what functions I need to write. Because I really wish there were just something that would give me the darn list so I could append it. So I'm just going to write it that way anyway. Now let's actually make it real. Const render list equals this arrow function. So render list's primary job is going to be to create a UL element and return it. How do I create a UL element? A UL element. Say again? Yep. Document.create element. Name of the element is UL. That'll do it. I should probably save that to a variable. And don't forget to return it when we're done. Sam 9000. Okay, very good. Sorry. It's going to take me a while because there's like 9 million of you critters. All right. Now what if I refresh right now? Well, I don't get any errors, so that's cool. I didn't try to use something that doesn't exist. Well, I haven't submitted the form yet, have I? All right, Sam 9000. He of color burnt orange. Only 12 years old. Born there. I don't see anything. I did not get any errors. So what happened? Down here in our dev tools, we have our console that we've been using, but there's also this elements tab, which is handy and lets me inspect the DOM. This is not the same thing as view source, by the way, because view source represents just the HTML that was actually sent back from the server. This represents the current state of the DOM, so it may not perfectly match the original HTML. So let's drill into this section here. We see our div that contains the form. Here's our details div, drill into that. And hey, it's an empty UL. So it worked. We successfully created a UL and appended it to details. Congratulations, us. But it needs to have stuff in it. A bunch of list items, right? So several times we need to add a list item to this UL. We could set the inner HTML, but we're not doing that anymore. We're cooler than that now. How do we want to do this? If we were to add another function, what would you name it? The details div needed a bunch of, well, it needed a list, right? So we made render list. The list needs a bunch of list items. So what if we made a function called, say again? Somebody said something. Render item or render list item or something like that. Yep, sounds good to me. Render item, render list item, I don't care which one. And so that is going to be a list item document.create element li. We're going to return that. And what's the li going to have in it? We had the name of the field and the value, right? So render item, if we're going to reuse this same function for all of them, we're going to need to pass those things in, right? So let's go ahead and pass in name and value. And then we could do something like item dot text contents equals, I'm going to use a template string with backticks. Then I can do my interpolation with the $ curly brace business. Say name, colon, space. Notice the colon is outside the curly braces, right? That's not part of the interpolation. And put value over here. We could test this function in isolation. Let's just try calling render item name, fruit, value, apple. And I get back an li that says fruit, colon, apple. Looks good. But now I need to loop over something and call that several times. How are we going to do that? There's several ways I can think of. Basically, render list, because all these things, these are down here in handle submit. And those are only in scope for as long as handle submit is running, right? These variables are not available outside of this function. So they're not available inside render list, much less render item. So we have to get them there. How should we do that? We need to pass all of those suckers to render list so that we can loop over them and call render item. How would you recommend doing that? Yes.
What I did was I grabbed all the elements from the form and I put them in an array and looked over that array.
Grab all the elements from the form, put it in an array, and loop over that array. So how did you do, how?
I used form.elements.
Okay, cool. We're going to do that in a bit. That is our ultimate solution. That's kind of what we're getting at here. We can avoid hard coding the names of these things. But from that suggestion, we need an array to loop over or something like that, right? We need something to loop over. So we could, instead of saving all of these things to separate variables, we could do something like const form values and make an array. But we need both the names and the values. So it's a multi-dimensional array, and each array has both the name and the value. We could do that. That's too much work. I don't like it. We have a better structure than an array for something like this. We have JavaScript objects. Objects are basically key value stores, meaning that they are a set of keys and their values. And you create them with a curly brace instead of a square bracket. They're very much like associative arrays in PHP, if anyone knows PHP. Not too different from hashes in Ruby or maps in Python and some other languages. JavaScript does actually have maps, but they have some issues. So here's what I mean. We could have something like person, square brackets. And then I will have key colon some value, like name, Seth, hair color, blonde, handsomeness level, devilish, that sort of thing. So keys and values. And the values can be anything. These happen to be strings, but they could be numbers or other objects or DOM nodes or whatever. The keys are generally strings. It does let you index them by other things, but generally we keep them as strings. And if they are strings, and if they follow the naming rules of JavaScript variables, like they don't have spaces, they don't have dashes, stuff like that, then you don't need to put quotes around them. But really, this is the same thing as this. These keys are actually strings. We just don't have to write them that way. It looks nicer without them. So I'm not going to put them there. Another thing you can do is leave a trailing comma on the last item. That may offend your sensibilities, but it's recommended for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, if you add another item later, you won't have an error because you forgot the stupid comma. Because you forget the stupid comma all the time if you don't just put it there all the time. Furthermore, when you add another item later and you commit that to your Git repository and you look at the changes in that commit, it's not going to show you that both of those lines changed. It's only going to show you the line that really changed, the line that you added. So I'm going to leave a trailing comma there. I mean, I'm not really going to use this object, but And then I can access the stuff in that object like this. Person dot hair color. Or person square bracket the string hair color. I can only use the dot notation because these all followed the naming rules of JavaScript variables. If they had spaces in them, if they had dashes in them or anything else that would keep us from using that same name as a variable name, I could not use dot syntax. I would have to use square brackets. Now, square brackets have another advantage, which is that it could be a variable. So I could say const field name equals handsomeness level, the string handsomeness level, and then I could say person square bracket field name. If, on the other hand, I said person dot field name, it would look for a field that's actually named field name. You dig? So we can use some of these tricks. All right. So instead of doing this big mess, I'm not going to call it person form values. I actually like the name person because that's what it is. So I'm going to just copy all these in here for right now. Dang it. There we go. Highlight those. Hit Command right bracket on Mac or Control right bracket on Windows and indent. Use left bracket to unindent. Handy dandy. Now I just need to change these to the right notation, right? Here's another little trick. Multiple cursors. We did that yesterday by holding down Alt, right? So I put a cursor here. I hold down Alt, put one underneath it. Backspace. Yeah. So I'm going to put my cursor right after all the equal signs. Backspace, 2 spaces. Put in the colon. Move to the end of the line with Command right arrow. I assume the end key on Windows. I don't know if there's another shortcut for that. And put a comma. There we go. Piece o' cake. Ein Stück Kuchen. So now, I could pass those into render list. Let's move our color div business up a little higher. All right, render list. Now I'm passing in this person. So let's make sure render list accepts an argument. And again, JavaScript doesn't enforce the number of arguments that a function takes, but it's going to be harder to use it if we don't pass it in. You actually can get to unnamed arguments, but we're not doing that right now. All right, so I've got it. Now what? I need to loop over it. But it's not an array. It's this object thing. Did everybody do mirror mirror in the Code Wars challenge? You had to loop over all of the keys in that object, right? So one way to do that would be to convert it to an array of just the key names. So an array containing person name, hair color, age, and birthplace. How do we do that? Yeah, it's actually loop, but how do we get that array to loop over? How do we take this object and get an array containing just the keys? Anybody do this? How do we get an object's keys? and object's keys and object dot keys. Yes. Capital O object dot keys. Now, obviously, you would have had to look that up or email me to figure it out, but there we go. So if we say object dot keys people or person, we expect to get back an array that looks like this. Person name, hair color, etc. So then we can loop over it. And I heard for loop from our associate Charlie McGorley. So let's say for let I equal 0, I less than object.keys person.length, I plus plus. Why did I use let instead of const? Yes. I is going to get reassigned every time we do that. Can't do that with a const. All right. So what we need to do ultimately is call render item. So let's say something like let li equals render item something list dot append child li. So we need to pass in the name and the value. How do we get those two things inside this loop? What about the name? What about the key? How do I get the current key inside this loop? Well, we're looping over object.keys, right? So object.keys person square bracket I. Because object.keys person returns an array containing just person name, hair color, etc. So this is going to be person name the first time through, hair color the second time through, age. What about the value? The value is somewhere inside person, right? We're not going to be able to use dot notation because we don't have the name of the thing to hard code it. So we'll have to use square brackets and pass in the name. And the name is this whole mess with the square brackets and everything. Yuck. But it seems like it could work. Let's see what happens. Refresh. Tappity tappity. Hair color is not defined. At line 31. Yeah, no, it sure isn't. All right. Now, no surprise, this is back to just being the hex value, but that's okay. That worked. But yeah, seriously, yuck. This looks horrible. There are a couple of ways we could clean this up. We could at least set object keys person variable first. You don't need to copy this down because I'm just going to backspace over it anyway. We could say const keys equals object.keys person. And say keys.length keys sub I person square bracket keys square bracket I, which is still gross, but it's better. But there's a better way. If you want to do the same thing to all of the items in an array, we can use array map. So let's look that up. JavaScript array map. array prototype map on the MDN, developer.mozilla.org, the Mozilla Developer Network. This is, for all intents and purposes, the official documentation for JavaScript. So it's a great resource. The map method creates a new array with the results of calling a provided function on every element in this array. So it's going to call a function on every element in the array. So we just need to make that function do what we want. We don't really care about the fact that it's going to create a new array containing those results. We just care that it's going to run that function every time. So let's have a look at that. Okay, syntax array.map, and you pass in a callback and optionally some other argument. Okay. So when we pass in functions to other functions, we typically call those callbacks. Because we're not calling those functions, the function is going to call that function later. So our array, well, we still need object.keys person. So that, remember, is our array containing person name, hair color, age, birthplace, just those strings. Call map and pass it a function, just like we did with add event listener. So we can name this function, or we can just do it in line here. All right, so how do we write this function? How do we know what that's like? Okay, so the parameters to map, first one is callback. And callback is a function that produces an element of the new array taking 3 arguments. So our callback is going to take 3 arguments. Current value, the current element being processed in the array. So if this contains person name, hair color, age, then the first time through, this argument is going to be person name. Second time through, it's going to be hair color. So let's just call that field name. Or if you want, key. Whatever. Key's not bad. All right, we're looping over the keys, so this is each individual key. Second argument is the index of the current element being processed in the array. So that's I. The third argument is the actual array that you're looping over. So it's the keys array. It is the result of object.keys person. So now we can just do whatever we want with all of that. And yes, it's going to return another array, but we're not doing anything with the return value of map. We're just taking advantage of the fact that map will call this function that many times. So what's it need to do? It needs to create that li by calling render item and append it to list. So render item needs those 2 arguments, the name and the value. So what's the name? Key. Yep, it's each item in the array. What's the value? It's not key, it's not I, and it's not keys, nor is it stored in that keys array. It comes out of person, right? So it's person, square bracket, key. So if the first time through the loop, this key parameter gets set to person name, what's person square bracket person name? It's the value from the form, right? So this is a much more succinct way to do the same thing, with fewer square brackets inside of square brackets, which are just the worst. So does that make some sense? It takes some practice to get used to map, but it's a very, very handy way to just do something to all the elements in an array without having to mess with incrementing I yourself and all that stuff. And the truth is, we don't really even need I in keys. We never used them, did we? And JavaScript doesn't enforce the number of arguments passed, so we could just get rid of those. And most of the time, frankly, when we use map, we're going to leave those out. Most of the time, we only care about the current item in the array. What you'll sometimes see people do when a function receives arguments that you're not actually going to use is just precede those names with an underscore. That lets us know as we're reading the code that those arguments are there to remind us, since this is the first time we're ever using map. But it lets you know these aren't going to be used. So that's just a convention. The underscore isn't magic or anything. It's just a signal to us, the person reading the code. So do you believe me? Think it's going to work? Think it's all lies? Jacques. That's how you spell Jacques. Yeah. Right? Is there a C? Yeah. Jacques. Hey, it worked. Pretty nice. Now I'm a little bummed about the color here. Yeah. I mean, you can. Do you like to just do the bare minimum, sir? I'm just kidding. That is probably going to be the easiest way to do that. So let's see what we got. We got render color here already returning the div, right? So now we just need to call it at the appropriate time. Where's the appropriate time? What if that were just the value here? Instead of passing in the hex value, you just pass in the result of render color form dot hair color dot value. Now, if we just leave that as is, we're going to get object HTML div element, because we're expecting a string here. And that's not a string, but it'll force it into one. So we really need the HTML of the color div, right? Which is not inner HTML, because there's nothing inside that HTML, right? I think we established that yesterday. But outer HTML will do it. So now what'll happen? Now we get hair color, div background color, blah, blah, blah. Not quite what we wanted, because we're setting the text content. If we want to actually put a tag in there, then this needs to be inner HTML up here. So I don't know if that's how you were suggesting to do it, but that is one way we can do that, just by setting the inner HTML on the item. Whackety schmackety. There you go. Not too bad. Extract, render list, and render item functions. And now we're using array map like fancy people. So although we did use inner HTML here, this still basically satisfies the homework and the bonus credit. What about the super mega bonus credit? We're still hard coding the names of the fields down here and here. I don't ever want to see the string person name or hair color inside our JavaScript. How are we going to do it? Your buddy Nick alluded to this. Also, I happen to have a tab open in my browser if you can read something that small. HTML form element dot elements. I think we still have person form here as a global variable, so let's look at the form. Person form dot elements. Elements. And we see it's a little collection of all the inputs. There they are, indexed by name, age, birthplace, hair color. There's the length. There's a person name and 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's kind of array-like as well. Notice the button is there too, not just the actual inputs. So we'll have to ignore that somehow. Looks like the type of object here is an HTML form controls collection. Again, not strictly speaking an array, but it's an array-like thing because it's got these 0 through 4 indices. So let's look at form.elements. Again on MDN. The HTML form element.elements property returns an HTML form controls collection of all the form controls contained in the form element, with the exception of input elements which have a type attribute of image. You can access a particular element by using either an index or the element name or ID. So they're in there several times. Interesting. So what if instead of building this person object by hand, we just pass in form.elements? And what if we don't change anything else? Gray hair at only 32. I started turning gray at 17, so I wouldn't feel too bad. Neat. So we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, person name, hair color, age, and birthplace. And we get object HTML input element over and over. Well, it's something. It seems like a step in the right direction. But we're probably going to have to write render list a little differently. We're calling render item way too many times. Can we just call, now that person is this collection here and it has 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, do we have to do object.keys? Maybe we can just do person.map. Heck, let's try. Person.map is not a function. Bummer. Because person isn't an array. But what if it were? Capital A, array, dot from person. Lets us create an array from some other type of collection. You can't make an array out of just anything. But any sort of collection object, anything that's iterable, we can turn into a real array. And then we can call map. So let's look at what that gets us. I swear you're making that as hard to find as possible. So, Rohan, is it how you pronounce it? Yeah. Do not make a Lord of the Rings joke. Do not make a Lord of the Rings joke. It's a cool name. It's not quite Grayson Faircloth, who definitely sounds like some sort of knight. He's in the morning. But Rohan is definitely easily the second coolest name. I'm sorry. It's just a cool name. There were like 5 Daves in my class growing up. So boring. It's almost as generic as Sam, right? Object, HTML input element, undefined. Neat. But we got a more reasonable number of these things, right? So it looks like the key was, or no, each item in the array was, because they're not keys anymore, right? It's actually an array of the inputs. So the first argument to map, remember, is the current item in the array. So it looks like that's the input, or the button, right? The current item in the array. So we will rename this input. And the array itself is not keys anymore. It's the form inputs, or whatever you want to call it. Form elements. How's that? And it's just there to keep track of. So render item needs the name of the current thing. But what we have is the actual input, the actual HTML element. We know how to get the value from one of those, right? It's just .value. So how do we get the name of it? So remember, input will be one of these things. If I want to get person name, that's the name. It would stand to reason that we could just say input.name. I think we can do it. I didn't even notice there are 2 Claytrons in here. How about that? Either you go by Clay or you go by Clayton. Or Claytron. No? Okay. That's good because Claytron is already taken on Twitter. That's Clayton Parker, who was a Python developer in Indianapolis. All right. Claytron 4000. Hair of teal. Now we're getting somewhere. We're back to our color div not looking right, but we're back to printing out all the right stuff. And we do have this down here. What's that? It's the button. Right. So how are we going to keep that from happening? So the button has neither a name nor a value. So we could put a check in there. We could check for the absence of those things. So do we check for the absence of a name or the absence of a value? Check for the absence of a value. So here's the question. What if they leave age blank? Do we want it to say age : nothing, or do we want to leave that line out? What do you prefer? Who wants to leave the word age with nothing on the other side of the colon? Way to be bold. Take a stand. Who wants to do the other thing? Everyone else is pretty neutral. I respect your moxie, sir, but you have been outvoted. So we will check for the presence of a value. So inside our map function, we will say if input.value then create the thing and append it. Whoops. One more time. That is Billy. If I had just been able to see the decal on your laptop, I would have remembered Billy. You know why I would have remembered Billy? I'm so glad this is being recorded. Because of the video game player Billy Mitchell, who was the one-time record holder for Donkey Kong and Pac-Man and a bunch of other old arcade games. He was the first person to really master Pac-Man. And his name's Billy, obviously. He has a resplendent beard and ridiculous mullet, and always wears an American flag tie. So, that laptop is the equivalent of Billy Mitchell's tie. Yeah, the King of Kong. He is a fantastic villain. All right. I don't remember what we just did, but it worked. Oh, yeah. We got rid of the button, right? We got rid of the button, and it worked. So now we want our color div back. So now what do we do? First, let's go ahead and commit this. Avoid hard coding the input names in JavaScript. So how do we fix this? Let's fix it in such a way, now that we've got this to the point where we could add new form fields without even knowing the names and still print them out. Let's prove that real quick. Reputation. Type text. Davy hair color. Let's find a nice fleshy skin tone. I am a lot more pale than that. Whatever. White is the absence of color for our intent, for our purposes. Reputation, cool as ice. In my own mind. Kokomo, Como. And reputation just showed up. We didn't have to do any more work on the JavaScript side. Isn't that neat? What if I added another color field? Oh, by the way, this broke. Did we not? Well, we haven't fixed it yet, right? We're going to fix it in such a way that if I added another color field, it would still work. How can we do that? How do we know? Yes. Ho, 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 yeah. Listen to Frere Jacques. Yeah. Based on the type. So, let's do this. Let's create a value variable, input.value, and then if input.type triple equal the string color value equals color render color passing in value. Now I've got a problem here already. What did I do? I made value a const and then tried to reassign it. Cannot do it. Let's use let. Yes, sir. That's right. Yep. That's the very next thing I was going to say. Yep. So short version, use triple equal. Don't rely on double equal. Double equal tries to do some type conversion. So the result in short is really unexpected results sometimes because I tell you, it does some weird things. So the short version and all I told the morning was use triple equal. Forget the other exists. But sometime I would like to show you some of the really bizarre things that it does. But for example, the string 4 and the number 4, they're equal as far as double equal is concerned. Triple equal, no, they're not. So triple equal does check the type. But I guess that's equally short. Triple equal actually checks the type. So if input type triple equal color, value equals render color, that thing. And then what do we get? Let's save it, refresh, pick a color. I did save. Oh, yep. I'm not actually passing in my new fancy value variable. Thank you. Yay! Object HTML div element. So we could say render color value dot outer HTML. How's that? Do it again. I like it. Render color fields correctly. Gnarly. Super mega bonus credit. We got it. But I'm dissatisfied. We're cluttering up the global namespace. Person form is global. Render color. That function exists globally. All these things do. So what? What's the big deal? Why do I hate global variables so much? Part of why it's a bad idea is that very often you're pulling in scripts that other people wrote, or even more than one script that you wrote in the same scope. If everything's creating global variables all the time, sooner or later you're going to have a collision. You're going to have used the same name more than once, or some library that you're pulling in is going to have used the same name more than once. So just get in the habit of not creating global variables whenever possible. So let's look at a few different ways that we can get around it. Now, again, you don't necessarily need to copy down what I'm going to do because I'm going to undo it because I'm going to show you several different ways. But I will commit each time. So you can see each way if you look at my GitHub. And we are going to talk a little more about how GitHub works. So we talked earlier about the fact that the variables I declare inside this function are not available in this function. Right? Each new function creates a new variable scope. So we could wrap the whole thing in a function. Indent all of this using that trick I mentioned a couple minutes ago. Command right bracket or control right bracket on Windows. Now, it doesn't particularly like this. It's actually okay to make this an anonymous function, but let's do wrap it in parentheses. Now it's all inside a function. So I've created no global variables. They're all local to this function. That never gets run. So none of this stuff is ever actually going to happen, right? No problem. We'll just run it. As soon as we create this function, we'll just run it right on the spot. This is a fairly common pattern, common enough that it has a name. This is an iffy, an immediately invoked function expression. So when you have an anonymous function like that you immediately invoke with the invocation operator, your parentheses, it's called an immediately invoked function expression. And it's a pretty common way in old school JavaScript to keep from polluting the global scope. So let's have a look. Matt. Yellow hair. Still works. Let's use our built-in Git support. Wrap everything in an iffy. Cool. Oh, here's another trick to get to the terminal without going out to the terminal. Command backtick on Mac, I think, or maybe it's control backtick on both. It is control backtick on Mac and Windows. Opens up a little terminal right inside VS Code. Pretty sweet. And notice it even puts it inside the directory for this project. But I promised other ways of doing this, and also the thing you use for template strings. I said something about this being a common way to do it in old school JavaScript. And this is another one of those cases where var and let are different. With the keyword var, variables that you declare are local to the enclosing function. With let and const, they are local to the enclosing block. And the block is basically anytime you see curly braces, except in an object literal, like the object we had earlier. But an if, a loop, anything like that. Those are new blocks. So if I create a new variable inside here and try to use it outside, I can't. Not even within the same function. But we can in ES6 if we use const and let exclusively. So instead of wrapping it in a function, we just wrap it in a block. Just a set of curly braces. And that's enough. Try that, refresh the page. Can we get to person form? No, we cannot. Person form is not defined. But does it still work? Yes. Let's show off our new trick.